Voters won't just be weighing in on candidates this November. Idahoans can also vote on whether the legislature should be able to call itself back into session outside of the regular legislative session, usually the first 3 months of the year. Currently, the Idaho Constitution allows only the governor to call lawmakers back to Boise for a special session. And while lawmakers have wanted to have that same power for years, the COVID-19 pandemic and the associated executive orders and emergency declarations issued in 2020 pushed that concern to the top of the priority list, with some lawmakers gathering for an unofficial session in June 2020.
We believe that there's been some overreach, and the legislators have really tried, and our constituents have really been on our backs. So we tried to convene today. We tried to get a quorum. That did not work, but we are signing on to something and giving it to our governor just to let him know that we really want to be a part of these decisions.
I took an oath to the Constitution to defend and protect it. And when it is being violated, I think it's my duty to speak up. We have never had an opportunity to publicly say how we feel.
We need to be able to make sure that the checks and balances of government are solid and in place.
Little eventually summoned lawmakers for a special session later that August.
What a week it was. On Monday, the legislature gavelled in to consider COVID-19 related elections and liability issues. Before the legislature was even able to begin, however, Capitol Police had issues trying to enforce social distancing in the fourth floor gallery overlooking the House. But despite the distractions, lawmakers were still able to get work done, passing legislation that would require an option for in-person voting for all future elections, loosen dates for absentee vote counting, and limit COVID-related liability for certain businesses and entities.
Tensions over pandemic orders spilled into the following 2021 regular session, with some legacy GOP officials defending Little's actions.
It's not unusual during disasters that the governor is at the scene of the incident, and they need a decision immediately. That is not the time that a governor should say, "I'll get back to you, I must check with the legislature."
The House kept its foot in the door that summer, leaving lingering questions about the precedent set for future legislative sessions.
Special sessions, regardless of the source, are going to have to be special. It's the check and balance system that we all are familiar with, and that's what we've done. It seems to, and we'll see how it works. But again, this is not a backdoor to a full-time legislature. None of us want that.
After the Idaho legislature approved a Senate joint memorial on a constitutional change in 2021, the issue now goes before voters and needs a simple majority to pass. Joining me to discuss the pros and cons of the constitutional change are Senate President Pro Tem Chuck Winder and House Assistant Minority Leader Lauren Necochea. Senator Winder, I wanted to start with you. Why should Idahoans sign on to this proposal?
Well, I think if everybody will think back to the COVID problems we've had, even back to when we had the floods back in 96 and 97, when these types of emergencies come up, the legislature has a role to play in that. Under the current Constitution, only the governor can call us back for a special or extraordinary session. We were getting literally hundreds of phone calls a day from constituents saying, "You guys, why aren't you doing your job? Get back in there," and we had no ability to do it.
You know, the floods in 96, 97, there are Idaho voters now who were born after that happened. Why did the legislature need to be part of that emergency discussion?
Under the Constitution, we're the appropriating body. We're the policymakers, and we think that when there are those types of emergencies, that the money that gets appropriate ought to come from the legislative action and not from the executive.
You know, why should the threshold be 60% instead of a 2/3 majority for lawmakers to submit a petition and say, you know what, we do want to call ourselves back to Boise?
Well, you know, we're one of 13 other states that have no ability to call themselves into session. basically under any circumstance. There is a provision if we're attacked by Martians or a foreign government, we have the ability to come back in emergency session, but I just think that what happens, the governor needs to be able to react quickly. We give him all the authority he needs. That's where he gets his authority primarily. And once that initial reaction is made, there are a lot of decisions that need to be jointly made, money appropriated. We got $1 billion on the first round of ARPA funding.
That was federal COVID assistance
Right.
funds.
And we had no say in it until we were back in session again, almost a year later.
Representative Necochea, I want to bring you into the conversation. Why shouldn't lawmakers be able to call themselves back?
Well, this would be a departure from 130 years of tradition. And for all that time, only the governor has been able to call the legislature back into session with a specific agenda. And I think that's been a good thing because it's a big deal to call us all back. And it's a slippery slope if we open up ourselves to special sessions all the time. We saw that Utah just gave this ability to the legislature, and they have called 6 special sessions since then, one of which had the result of just sending a letter to Congress, stating that Utah lawmakers didn't like something that they'd done. So it was really used more for grandstanding than for policy. The senator raised the very good point about emergencies. We have to be able to react quickly in emergencies, and letting the governor just do the job is the best way to do that. When your house is on fire or you're facing a flood, the last thing you need is 105 legislators coming to town and going through their process of, getting committees together. And I'm actually fearful of what would have happened if the legislature had come into session in 2020. I think all of those emergency needs that people had, the business loans, unemployment, personal protective equipment for healthcare workers, I think all of those things would have been at risk. I think the reason the legislators wanted to come in was to stop the emergency response from happening, and that would be very disconcerting. Just as when the house is on fire, we need to have someone who can take executive action, and that's why we have the executive branch.
And we have a code that gives him lots of authority. But we thought he overstepped his authority in several areas, appropriating $1 billion over a 9-month period. There wasn't any fire at the time with those dollars. There were things that could have been done. Utah is a very unusual state. They can only have a 6-week session. And so
a 6-week regular session.
Right. So they have a history of having all sorts of extra sessions for things. But I also think that what we tried to do with the 60% is it's hard to get a majority between the House and the Senate on issues. We think it'll be very difficult to get 60% of both bodies to agree. The amendment requires that it has to be specific agreement on the issue that's brought forward. So we put some really good sideboards on it that'll protect the public. And I don't think we're going to go there and try and interfere with the governor or whatever, but I do think we have a constitutional obligation, and certainly the public thinks we do, because they ripped us up pretty good. They ripped us up in the primary, they ripped us up in the press, that we were not there to respond and to listen to them and to help them.
I'm curious, though, what happens if 60% of the respective bodies submit a proposal on something that leadership disagrees with? And I'm thinking things like grocery tax repeal. How would that situation play out?
Well, I think, that's an interesting question, because the way it is written, as long as 60% agreed, then the pro tem and speaker would have to, because they can do an independent petition if they wish to. But it's still up to the speaker and the pro tem to call that, under this amendment, to call them into session. So I think you're going to see plenty of restraints, plenty of sideboards on, basically runaways or a wide open type of a session.
Well, and you bring up the 60% threshold. That's actually, I think, insufficient to prevent a special session that's just about grandstanding and not actually going to get legislation passed. That's not a veto-proof majority. So if you have a governor who doesn't want to, who's opposed to the session and the proposal, and only 60% of legislators, they can come to town, spend money, and maybe they'd want to do this before an election day and get their names in the press, which helps incumbents. But then you're not going to have a veto-proof majority to actually pass something. So I don't know why we would do this with a 60% threshold instead of the 2/3.
In my opinion, we ought to do it with a simple majority, because we ought to be the legislature. We're a separate and equal body of government, separate branch of government. We're supposed to be equal to the governors and to the judicial branch, but under the current Constitution, we're not even close. And you know, when you start looking at bureaucracy, when you start looking at how does the legislature react to various things going on, there's no ability to do it. We're at the mercy of the executive branch. And so I think 60% is really a high bar. Some states don't have any requirement. They just have to agree, and the Speaker and the Pro Tem can call them to session. Other states have 2/3 requirements. But why would a legislator want to have a 2/3 requirement on something that really they are constitutionally obligated to do? And so I think, to me, it's just a bogus argument to say, well, the threshold's too low.
Does this push us closer to potentially having a full-time legislature, though?
Some will say that, but the way we're set up right now, people have jobs, they have ranches, they have farms, they have families they're raising, businesses they're running. I only know of a few people in the legislature that probably would like to see it year-round, but that's not going to happen. And I think it could happen in the future as the state gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But there's no will, at least in the Senate caucus and majority, to have a year-round, because we all have families, we all have lives outside of the legislature, and I really think that this would enable us maybe to even have shorter sessions for regular sessions, and we could then deal with special situations that come up in the future.
Well, and that concerns me, because I think the structure that we have, where we do our business during a predictable time of year, that means the advocacy groups, businesses, citizens who want to get involved in the process have predictability. We can operate under normal procedures where a bill gets introduced and then time passes, days pass before there are hearings, and the public can go and testify and make plans to do that. We have a careful, deliberative process. And I'd be very concerned about shorter sessions and then sporadic special sessions throughout the year, because it narrows who can participate both as legislators and as citizens who want to get involved in their government. As the senator said, we have a part-time legislature, and a lot of people have full-time jobs outside of that. It's hard enough to get 3 months off to try to do that, and I think it'll make it even harder for people to participate if they have to brace for unexpected special sessions around the year. And we don't want to have a legislature that's just people who are retired or independently wealthy, who have all that latitude. But it's especially true for just the citizens who want to have a say in their government. When we have a special session, often a bill can get printed and enacted in one day when we suspend all of the rules. And so that means a lot of Idaho voters could be reading about it in the paper after it happened, and not even get a chance to have see the proposal in the full light of day and evaluate it, and then contact their legislator and let them know how they feel about it.
And I think that argument doesn't hold water either, because during COVID, we kept our Capitol open. We allowed the public to come and testify. Our neighboring states locked their capitals. People were not allowed to come into the capitals to testify. And so I think we have always taken the approach of the public needs to participate. We even did on the tax cuts this time. So I think that, at least to me, the argument that, gee, we could be year-round, there's nothing in the Constitution that prevents us from not being year-round now. In fact, we saw it after the 21 session when the Senate sine died. In other words, we tried to end the session, and the House said, no, we're going to recess until December 30th. And that was constitutionally fine. And so I think to me, it's just a bogus argument that if we don't pass this amendment, we're not going to have year-round sessions. We could do it next year if we wanted to. I mean, it's that simple. But no one wants it to be year-round. No one wants it to be full-time. The Senate has one full-time staff person and one full-time secretary for the Senate that does all the procedures that we do. So we're run on a very thin line. We're not a full-time. We don't want to be a full-time. People should be very confident that people want to go home and do their jobs.
Representative, I'm curious, because over the past few years, we've all seen legislative sessions extend because either caucuses can't agree on something or the House and the Senate can't agree on something, whether they're transportation issues like we saw in 2015, education, all sorts of different issues. If this potentially changes the dynamic of the regular sessions and lets lawmakers say, you know what, let's go ahead and adjourn, leave this on the table, knowing that we can come back in June or July, does that change the argument for you, knowing that it might potentially, in the long run, save taxpayers money if you're not extending 6 weeks unnecessarily?
I mean, based on how I've seen the legislature operate, it's the temptation is always to extend, and that's why we extended, almost the full year in 2021, and came back for a reconvening that could have been an email, because the only thing we passed was again, as in Utah, a letter to Washington D.C. saying we didn't like some things. When we had to shut down for COVID in 2020, we then extended for weeks and weeks longer. We were, near the end of what we needed to do for budget. And I think sometimes the longer the session goes, and the more special sessions you call, the more ideas come up. And we saw that in the 2020 special session, where we were supposed to have a narrowly defined topic around COVID liability, and the House was printing all kinds of bills that were way outside, according to the Constitution, the scope of what we were there to do, and no one was stopping them from doing that. And it was taxing on the resources of our legislative services, who were churning out bills that were outside of the constitutional process. And we spent a week just with this infighting and the power struggles between.
And I would just say that no one on the House side stopped it. The Senate stopped it. We told them from the very beginning that we thought the additional bills were unconstitutional and they're not within the proclamation that the government put out to call us back into session, and we didn't hear any of those, even though they sent over a bunch of bills. And so that's the way the system's supposed to work. It's not supposed to be easy to pass bills, and that's why we have two bodies, so that each one of them can protect the public and hear what the public has to say. And I always tell people, remember, 36, 18, and 1, 36 House members, 18 senators, and 1 governor to get a bill passed. It's not easy.
We have about 2 minutes left. I'm curious if your view on this might be different if you weren't in the majority. You and your fellow members of leadership crafted this with a caucus that was on your side. That dynamic could and will change in the future, whether it's next year or in 50 years. Are you still going to be on board with this?
Well, you never know what happens in 50 years. That's why the Constitution could be amended. But I think the reality is the minority should want to come in, because they're hearing different things than we're hearing. And where's the best place to deal with that? In a legislative session. So I think there's a way to provide that balance. The 60% was the effort. The trying to define it very specifically as to what the agenda would be was our way of trying to make it so it isn't a wide open.
Yeah.
And would your view on it change if there were more Democrats at the table, if Democrats were closer to 50-50 or even in the majority?
No, because I want a structure that protects us, even when, as the senator said, we don't have that restraint. The senator referred to this restraint that the Senate exercised when the House was operating outside of the bounds of the Constitution, but that was based on the individuals who happened to be in the Senate at that time. And so I want a structure that protects us no matter who's making the call and who's making the decisions.
Senator, very briefly, if this proposal does not pass in November, what might the legislature do next?
Well, I think they'll reconsider, try and get more education to the public and try and get the public involved in it. Right now, I'm being told by lots of people that they're in favor of it and they're voting for it, in spite of the opposition we've had.
All right. Senator Chuck Winder, Representative Lauren Necochea, thank you so much